Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Security Space podcast. Today we are in for round 3. We are getting through to it now. We are over the halfway mark, and it is part of the incident response lifecycle with our usual guests, Si and James. And what we're discussing today is containment, eradication, and the recovery from said incidents. So, why are we discussing that today? Well, essentially, when an incident has occurred, it's not just stopping the bleeding, it is essentially making sure that it doesn't happen again. You can't just come in and put a plaster over it and be like, cool, yeah, everything's sorted. It doesn't work like that, life doesn't work like that, and you've got to think further ahead, like, why did this happen, how do we stop it moving forward? So, to get straight into it then, chaps, James, I'll come to you first. So there is obviously different ways of approaching an incident, whether that be short-term strategies, long-term strategies, and essentially there's different strategies in terms of what you do in the first 24 hours to what you do in the first week to maybe when it's like finished and it's the end of the first month. Can you sort of talk me through when an incident has occurred, sort of like what is the immediate situation that you deal with, and then how do you progress the plan to a more sort of long-term strategy?
Good question. And yeah, it is sometimes, as you said, it's easy to concentrate just on the short-term solution, whereas it's actually the long-term that needs to be addressed, right? So fundamentally your short-term goal is to stem the bleeding. And the way that I would kind of analogize this, if that's a word, is think of like a traumatic injury and going into a hospital, right? You have something happen at the side of the road, paramedics come, they get you into a stable state, they take you into hospital, and then you have a long-term recovery after that. And that's kind of the attitude that we go into. It does a little bit depend on the type of incident that you've suffered from, and we were saying just now, there's a lot of ransomware going around at the moment, and it's been all over the news. And so we're spending a lot of time dealing with ransomware incidents at the moment. So it's particularly in those incidents, you have some very, very short-term problems. And those short-term problems are, you've got a threat actor who has your data and wants you to pay, otherwise they're going to release the data. You've got the initial effect of the ransomware, you've got your operations that are affected, you've got all of that kind of those problems that you have to deal with. But then as you're doing that, as you're responding to that, you do need to keep an eye on that long-term strategy. The one thing you don't want to do, and what we advise clients against all the time, is just reverting back to the state they were in before it happened. Because the state that you were in before it happened caused this to happen. It didn't cause it to happen, but it contributed to this happening, right? It allowed it to happen. So as you're transitioning through that eradication, through that recovery, you have to keep one eye on that long-term solution, which generally for most organizations, and I don't know about your experience, but for most organizations, the long-term strategy looks very, very different to where they were when it happened. And so you need to prioritize getting back up and running. You need to get operational, but you need to do so securely and in a way that's going to support you further securing the environment in the long term. And so for a lot of clients that we work with, sometimes that's hey, look, I'm really sorry, but the environment that you have now is gone. Just imagine that it's gone from the face of the earth, and you actually have an opportunity here to start again. You can, in your wildest dreams, you never would have thought that you would have the opportunity to just start everything from scratch. Everything that you had in your long-term roadmap, everything you thought you'd do in 3 years' time from an IT and from a security perspective, you can do that now. And so sometimes it's about turning that into actually an opportunity to accelerate your transformation strategy. And it can be difficult to balance those, but it can be really difficult to balance those priorities. But fundamentally, you always have to have one eye on the long-term strategy. Otherwise, and we've seen this happen again with clients who haven't recovered properly, is that it just happens again. They'll be in the same situation in 3-6 months' time.
Agree, sir? Anything to add on to that?
100% agree. Perfectly put. Yeah, it's exactly what it is. They can't just they can't revert, often their backups are gone anyway, but if they do have backups, often they will rush to a recovery stage, restore their backups from a week before the incident, a couple of days before the incident. The threat actor is still on there. The threat actor may have been on their infrastructure for weeks or months prior to that, so they have that persistence. So they cannot rush through anything when it comes to the recovery, because they will be back at square one, which is unfortunate, and that's one thing we've got to avoid, because it makes the instant response organisations look incompetent, but at the same time it looks bad on the victims as well, because they will just keep going through it unless they do it properly and engage with experts and listen to the experts at the same time.
That's really interesting points, chaps. And I suppose, like I say, one that's it's like I say, we're recording this just at the end of Q3 now. I suppose one of the most high-profile incidents that's occurred, obviously, in the last couple of weeks is the JLR one. And I suppose, like you say, it's a chance for them to be like, okay, this is high-profile. We can hit the reset button, but I suppose the key question here right now, and what is probably happening in terms of the stakeholder communications at this moment in time, is how do you actually get across this, that it could be a positive, when I'm just seeing in the news just like it's cost X amount of millions, they've lost X amount of staff, it's had X amount of impact on the supply chain. It's all very doom and gloom for them. So I'll come back to you on this one. How do you sort of communicate with the stakeholders about, okay, this has been an incident, and this is how we've got to move forward from it now? How do you get that communication across to them in the right way?
No, good. With empathy.
Yeah.
Empathy goes a long way in this industry, and we can't sit there in our ivory thrones dictating to them that this is what you should have done. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. So you just have to have that empathy with them and walk them through the consequences of what will happen if they don't listen to us. I say good thing, but the good thing is they've been through it and they've already seen the impact. So they don't want to go through that again. So often they will listen to us, and before the incident, they may have only spent a certain portion of money, a minute amount on IT security. Now they realise, if we had actually spent a little bit more, it could only be a little bit more, this wouldn't have happened. So you just be empathetic and use the examples that have already happened to them as to why they should do that. It's hard because they just want to get up and running straight away. Business interruption is one of the key things we need to support on and avoid any business interruption, because a lot of these companies, they're losing millions a day. Even companies that are losing thousands or hundreds of thousands a day, given the margins that they're working with, that's still a lot for them. So even smaller companies. When it comes to organisations like JLR, or when we work with manufacturing companies, that's where it's quite difficult, because they've got lots of niche systems in their environment that are unfortunately, they're using really old versions of Windows that are end of life. And they're often the patient zeros, as we call them. So back to the doctor analogy, patient zero that are targeted, but they can't upgrade it. So we have to support them in remediating in a way where they can still use that really clunky old version of Windows that they have to use because it supports some 20-year-old bit of CAD software or something like that on there. So yeah, show empathy and that we understand why they can't do certain things and support them in how they're going to remediate through.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic point.
And I would add to that it's, I think, definitely in the sort of security community, there is a bit of a culture, I think, where and there's a bit of a view that security people are just going to come in and tell you that you've done everything wrong, and and that is the attitude. Some of the organizations that I've worked with, where they just get consultants in pointing at everything, saying that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. This is why you have to have that empathy. You have to understand why they are where they are, and there is a reason for that, whatever that reason is. I think I might have said it on this podcast before, but I often, when people are asking me, what do you do for a job? I'm like, well, actually, 80% of the job really is walking into a boardroom and just giving them a hug and just telling them it'll be okay. and it is. There is such a human aspect to it. And empathy, understanding goes a long way. They know their business far better than we do. So we have to work with them to understand how can we ensure that they are working and can operate in a much more secure manner that is going to support their business and not hinder it. And yeah, it's a difficult balance sometimes.
Absolutely. And I just want to bring it back to a point you made, Si, about the business interruption. And I sort of want to ask you chaps about what happens on that initial call at the start when the incident has occurred, and it's like the alarm bells have gone off and it's like, cool, let's all jump on this call at some ungodly hour that it might be. At what point do you be like, okay, we've got to basically close off the business for X amount of days, which obviously will have an impact on the business in terms of revenue? Do you decide that? What metric do you use? Can you close off segments of the business? Basically, my question to you, and James, I'll come to you first, is how do you actually quantify the risk on that first call when the building's on fire and you've got to essentially be like, okay, this is the safest point to come in and we've got to close that off to all public access, X, Y, Z. How do you actually quantify the risk at the start?
It's I don't want to say it's a lot of guesswork. It's a lot of educated guesswork. Because at that point, you don't know. You have no idea. And certainly on that first call, right, we're just getting the information as to what's happened, what's led up to this. We certainly at that point have no idea what's happened. And the reality is, it could take 2, 3, 4 weeks before we actually find out what happened in the first place. So when it comes to thinking about containment specifically, you do have to make some very drastic calls. And sometimes you won't have a huge amount of evidence to back it up. Sometimes it's just a gut feeling. But that's a gut feeling that is trained by, 20 odd years of having done this through the threat intelligence that we have. One of the first things we do, particularly from a ransomware perspective, but with any incident, is we'll want to get an attribution to a threat actor as soon as we can. In ransomware, it's relatively easy because they'll leave a ransom note and they'll say who they are. Great, thank you. Not quite so easy with ransomware as a service, but just knowing that, okay, we know the actor, we know how they operate, we know what they're trying to achieve and how they're likely to achieve it. So when we're going into those calls and we're saying, look, actually, we think you need to close this area of the business or this area of the network for whatever reason, we've got that intelligence to back it up. And yeah, sometimes it is a little bit sort of, educated guesswork, but it's very educated guesswork. And, but fundamentally, the bottom line is it's a business decision. We can advise the business. We can say, look, this is what we've seen this actor do before in this situation. This is what we think they're going to do based on X, Y, and Z. And here's all the evidence. And this is what we've seen. But it is your decision. We're not going to get in the way of the business making money. The business has to make money. But it does get to a point where sometimes you have to say, well, you might have to close the business for 3, 4, 5 days because in order to contain this properly, this is what we need to do. And the hope is that they will see that, they will understand that, but then you'll put some guardrails around that, right? You'll say, okay, the plan is we close this off for X amount of time, but this is what we're doing in the meantime to get things back up and running, right? There's parallel work streams. There's always this balance between the forensic investigation, the containment, and business operations. And it's not a straightforward balance. It's always sort of at one point, the operations are going to be the absolute priority. At another point, they can take a bit of a lower priority and you can focus on containment. So it is a constant balance. But a lot of it comes down to threat intelligence, our experience. And sometimes you just go into it and you just see, this is what we've seen before. This is what we're pretty sure is going to happen. Yep. So this is what we think you need to do. But it's always a business decision.
Yeah. Anything to add on that side?
In regards to shutting down of the business temporarily, on occasion, the threat actor's already done that for us,
Right.
whereby they've left that network in such a state that it is not operational. So they have done a bit of the hard work for us in regards to communicating that, because their systems are not working. And then when it comes to actually getting them back online, I would say it's parallel work streams. There's only a finite amount of resources that are working on this. So always start with mission critical stuff in regards to getting that scrubbing the data, ensuring it's sanitized, making sure there's nothing malicious on there, or literally rebuilding from scratch. But starting from an intelligence point of view in regards to what the business needs first, rather than some back end system that they don't actually need. Don't put resources into that straight away. That can follow down the line.
Yeah. Okay. I've seen recently in the last few days, last few weeks, that there was a bit of one commonality. Well, there's probably several commonalities, but one main one between all the retail, the Co-op, the Harrods, the M&S, and now the JLR. A lot of it is they outsourced a lot of their IT and security to MSPs. Yeah. How does your roles come into it when these incidents have occurred, but there's been an outsource to another firm? Like, with it bringing in MSPs and supply chains, does it make your jobs 10 times harder? Is there a different playbook? Is there a different way to operate? How much do you bring the MSP in? How much accountability does the end user have? So I'll come back to you first on this one. What's your thoughts on what I've said there?
No, you're 100% right. And supply chain attacks are massive. It's so much easier for a threat actor to hit a part of that supply chain, and then it pivots off and hits multiple organizations. So they have to hit one organization, which will then fork off, and they can attack multiples from there. So it's easier for them. And when it comes to the due diligence of the victims on the supply chain, there's only so much they can do. Often it'll have to be a case of, depending on what accreditation they have or some sort of compliance piece they're working on, it's a tick box sheet. Do you have this? Do you have that? There's no actual proof provided or anything like that. And it's difficult for organizations to do proper due diligence on their supply chain, as we all know. But when it comes to the actual attack and it's part of the supply chain, often we do not need to work on the supply chain itself, because they're a victim of maybe a credential theft, as opposed to the actual ransomware itself, because the threat actor don't want to hit the supply chain, because if they hit the organization, the MSP, then that means they're only hitting one. Whereas if they can, like I said before, if they can fork off and hit multiple organizations, it's better for them. So this MSP will occasionally be safe, and all the threat actor wants to do is get the credentials for somebody at their actual target itself. So JLR, for instance, or M&S. But we have to get them involved in it, because when we're doing our reporting, because obviously there's insurers involved, there's legal involved, ICO, for instance, we have to provide so much information that we do have to speak to the MSPs and work out what has happened, the root cause. But obviously our main focal point is the actual victim itself on that.
Nice. Anything to add on that, James?
Yeah, just that it varies depending on the relationship that that organization has with their MSP. Some organizations outsource everything from IT to security to the whole thing. Some organizations will just outsource a small part of that, and it might be that the MSP is not actually responsible for the security. So it's one of those situations where understanding the contract that the organization has with that MSP is absolutely critical, because if the organization was expecting that MSP to secure the whole thing, but actually the contract says nothing about security, then you haven't really got a leg to stand on. But 99% of the time, most MSPs are perfectly happy to work with us. There are some occasions where they will go, actually, no, we want to get our own organization in to come and do our own investigation. We don't want to give you guys access. In which case, it's about us then working with whoever they bring in to do that investigation. And, we're happy to do that. Yep. But yeah, it very much depends on that relationship, the extent of that relationship. It does make things trickier, but you have to have, if you can ensure free information flow of critical points between those organizations, what IP addresses are you seeing? What pieces of malware are you seeing? What kind? What's the general gist? What timeline are you kind of looking at? Then that helps. Then we can generally all get to a satisfying conclusion. But yeah, it does. It very much depends on that relationship, and a lot of the time, it does then come down to a matter of what does the contract say? Who is responsible for this, and who do we need to involve?
Okay.
One point on that. This is for anybody listening. So if you are the victim of a ransomware and the MSP is involved, do not let the MSP do the actual investigation, because at the end of the day, they're marking their own homework at that point. I'm not saying that they would hide anything. However, like I say, marking your own homework is the analogy that we use on these calls. We want support from the MSP, but we don't want them guiding the investigation or doing the actual investigation itself for any parts, because that's what we're impartial at the end of the day. So they need that.
That's it. It's that again, that accountability thing. They might have, like say, cover up important bits of evidence at the end of the day, and that's what is disingenuous in security. And like I say, the damage is done now. You can't. It's all about making sure that the end user is back to where they need to be at the end of the day. One of my final questions for you chaps is essentially is kind of at the point of entry, and does that dictate how the instant response plays out? Because obviously I know that we've spoke on previous episodes all about the playbooks, all about the preparation for it, and to use the doctor analogy that we've been using throughout it, a stab wound is different to a gunshot wound. It's all sorts of different points of entry, but it's the same damage at the end of it. You're losing blood, you're losing life, and therefore it's what you mentioned there about the leaked creds. Leaked creds is absolutely massive at the moment. Everybody that I'm speaking to, it's massive because of identity and NHI and the boom of AI. NHI and the boom of AI, too many acronyms to keep up with, that's exploding this initial threat vector. I'm not saying that's the one, but yeah, creds is absolutely massive. So does the point of entry dictate how you actually plan for the rest of the instant response? So I'll come to yourself.
In my opinion, no, not really, because like you say, the damage is done.
Yep.
We need to find out the point of entry. We need to find that patient zero, because we need to provide that root cause analysis as to why it has happened. However, if the threat actor's got in via an open RDP, remote desktop, for instance, as opposed to another method, social engineering, we actually don't care, because we want to lock most things down anyway. So it doesn't really matter to us how they got in, but we do need to provide that, because it will help with remediation, because we need to lock it down. But at the same time, what we're concentrating on is the actual damage. When it comes to the remediation, is the damage itself, which is the ransomware, which is the encryption, or the data exfiltration. The actual initial point of entry is helpful, but it's not it's not essential, if that makes sense. And a lot of times with the threat actors, they will utilize what we call anti-forensics. So they will try and cover their tracks, delete logs, they'll do all sorts of stuff. It's not always possible to find that patient zero and get that root cause. It just depends on what evidence is left for us to examine at that point.
Yeah, so it's like giving someone a parachute who's already at the ground, I'm guessing. It's like it's a little bit too late for that, is it? Yeah. James, anything to add on that, mate?
I lots of medical analogies today, but going back to the medical analogy, so the sort of root cause, that's, well, not the root cause, but maybe the point of entry, it does change how those first 24 hours are going to look, right? And because one of the things that you want to do is to make sure that the damage isn't going to get any worse. So if you can understand that sort of initial entry point, then it's like the paramedic at the side of the road, right? They are going to look at that. They have no idea what the damage actually is behind the wound, but they're going to stem the bleeding enough so that you can get through to a hospital. Understanding it is going to, at least as much as you can, because it's not always obvious, but as much as you can, it is going to change how the first 24 hours looks. As Si said, it's mostly about the damage. What is the damage? How can we fundamentally fix that damage and go from there? It's in the further investigation, really nailing down that root cause is key to locking down the security strategy moving forwards, because that's going to inform what your priorities are, whether it's identity, whether it's session token theft or credential theft or whatever. That is going to inform what your long-term security strategy looks like. But yeah, those first 24 hours will very much depend on what we know at that time. But it's the damage that we want to fix, and then we'll move on to that. There are definite phases to that response, and yeah, the long-term response is all about fixing the damage.
And that pretty much brings us to the end of part 3 of this 4-part series. So, the last leg, we will get this recorded sort of late November, early December, and that will be all about the post-incident activity. So we're talking sort of like when clients have been hit, sort of like, and it's 6 months to a year afterwards, and how they've sort of responded from it. Like we say, we touched on in this podcast how it can be an opportunity and how some companies can bounce back from it. So, like I say, keep your eyes out for that. But once again, if you've got any questions for the chaps raised today, I'll be sure to put all their information down below. But Si, James, thanks once again.
Thank you. Cheers.